Our top story of the day is a breaking development in the search for Laci Peterson, the pregnant California woman who vanished on Christmas Eve.
Police admit they are no closer to finding Laci Peterson than they were on Christmas Eve, the day she vanished.
I still was hopeful that Laci was okay.
Her husband reported her missing after he returned from a fishing trip, a trip he took by himself.
Well, I suspected Scott when I first met him. Didn't mean he did it.
Did he take a polygraph test? You have no idea where this is.
By the 2nd of January, Laci Peterson had been missing for 9 days, and every major news outlet in the country swarmed to Modesto in search of fresh fuel for their headlines, and as photos of the beautiful young pregnant woman circulated the globe, her family and friends were thrust into the spotlight right along with her. But as the press seized on the story, the narrative didn't take long to shift from Laci and the desperate search to find her, to her elusive husband Scott and his shaky alibi on the day she vanished. Her mother Sharon defended her son-in-law from the mounting rumors and increasingly blatant allegations in the press at every opportunity. Though the world would later learn that all the while, she was secretly tormented by her growing doubts about Scott, and terrified that she might be protecting a fiend. By the 2nd of January, detectives were nearly certain that she was, and when he visited the police station that day to pick up some keys, he asked a question that only heightened their suspicion towards him. Police still had possession of Laci's car, explaining to Scott that they needed to keep it longer than anticipated to replace the headliner after ripping out several portions of it to conduct blood tests. The tests were negative, but they wanted to fix the damage before giving it back. Since the cars were seized during the search warrant, Scott was using rentals because they were still processing his truck, and he welcomed the return of Laci's Land Rover on the 3rd, though he was unaware that a GPS tracker had been installed in it. But when Scott met with Craig Grogan to pick up the keys on the 2nd, he also dropped off a handwritten note documenting the $13.08 he put on his card for gas in Livermore on the 24th, along with a copy of Russell Graybill's schedule for that morning. Russell Graybill was the mail carrier for Scott and Laci's neighborhood. He had a different recollection of the morning of the 24th than neighbor Karen Service, but we'll go over that later. After giving the note and the schedule to Grogan, Scott surprised him with a question about Laci being targeted for her baby. Fetal abduction is the act of kidnapping a near-term mother with plans of stealing her baby, and it was a consideration in Laci's case from the start, but it was never a big one. Though we've all heard many horrifying cases about babies being crudely removed via cesarean by monstrous deviants who target pregnant women in order to kidnap a newborn, it's actually an extremely rare crime. Between the years of 1983 and 2015, there were only 302 recorded cases of fetal abduction in the entire country. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it brings us to a strange connection made during the investigation to an unstable woman with a criminal history, who'd recently lost her baby. She not only knew who Scott and Laci were, but where they lived, and she wasn't found through a random tip or anonymous lead, but arrested by Modesto police for stealing from them in late January. The woman was an addict named Sarah Taberna, and she'd been arrested for thieving Scott and Laci's checks out of the shared mailbox at the warehouse. The checks found in her possession were sent out after Laci disappeared, but the mail theft was an ongoing problem and Taberna admitted to stealing from there often. We'll recall from an earlier episode, the day before Laci went missing, Scott opened a post office box at Packmail because the mailboxes at the warehouse had been broken into. There'd actually been a rash of mail theft in the industrial park for some time, so much so that Detective Mike Hermosa called it a regular thing, and the incidents spiked even higher on the weekends when businesses were closed, and fewer eyes were around to spot the thieves. Modesto police had recently received a request to increase their patrols in the area to curb the problem. Sarah Taberna was hooked on meth, and stole from the mailboxes in exchange for drugs and a place to stay, from a local gang. They even provided her with stolen cars to do the thieving in. Sarah would pry the backs of the boxes open with a crowbar and hand the mail over to gang members, so they could use the sensitive information to fuel their identity theft and forgery operation. Granted, by the time Taberna was locked up, Everyone in Modesto knew who Scott and Laci were, and probably knew where they lived as well, but this woman specifically said she was too afraid to steal from their house, opting to steal from the warehouse instead, implying she may have been more familiar with them, or at least with where they lived. But Sarah Taberna also miscarried a baby the summer before, and she had one of Laci's reward flyers in her pocket when she was apprehended. Detective Hermosa made the arrest, reporting that her alibi for the 24th was partying with gang members while strung out on drugs, but there must not have been much more to it, because the matter wasn't pursued, and she nor any of the members of the gang were questioned further about Laci Peterson. Scott didn't know anything about Taberna when he went to see Grogan to get his keys on the 2nd of January, as she wouldn't be arrested and questioned until weeks later, but the theory was mentioned often enough over the past week that he and Grogan began to discuss it while he was there. It prompted Scott to ask if he thought after Laci had the baby, he might get half of his family back. Then his eyes welled up with tears, and he asked Grogan if he thought his wife was dead. The detective's response wasn't too reassuring, and though it sounds like Scott was showing some pretty strong grief along with his questions, Grogan thought they were suspicious. He not only told Scott every day that had gone by since she vanished, diminished the likelihood of her being found safe, he also said that he and the other core detectives had been assigned to another case, implying that they'd have less time to focus on finding Laci. Scott got the keys he came for and went home, though he'd find himself right back there the next day. On the morning of the 2nd, Sharon spoke with the media, where she again reiterated the trust she and the rest of Laci's family had for Scott.
I'm disappointed by the suspicion.
Of course I am.
Absolutely, everybody's feeling
We
different.
need to focus on Laci and getting Laci back.
Yes.
But on the 3rd, Modesto police made it clear they held a vastly different opinion. During the press conference that day, Doug Redenor wouldn't elaborate on whether or not Scott had taken a polygraph test, and told reporters that while he was being cooperative to some degree, police weren't ready to rule anyone in or out as a suspect. But the appeal Redenor made a moment later spoke volumes about their position. He displayed large pictures of Scott's truck and his boat. Then he explained to viewers that Laci's husband was in the Berkeley area that day, and asked anyone who'd seen him on the 23rd or 24th to call the police department. By this point, it was common knowledge that Laci'd gone missing while Scott was out fishing, but when the police asked for the public to help confirm his timeline for that morning, their doubts about his alibi and their apparent focus on Scott as a suspect became common knowledge as well. Directly after that press conference, Sharon heard Scott had been arrested. She immediately called Detective Grogan. Craig Grogan was Sharon's main point of contact during the search for Laci. She often called him with questions about the investigation multiple times a day, but this call was far different. She was shocked to hear of Scott's arrest, and her mind must have been racing as she considered what the charges might be. But once she had Grogan on the line, he informed her that her son-in-law hadn't been arrested at all. He was as free as he'd ever been. The detective heard the same rumor that morning and wasn't sure where it stemmed from, but assured Sharon there was no truth to it. Though it did turn out to be a sort of mixed-up version of part of the truth. Police did make arrests in connection with Laci's case, but they'd made them the day before, and it wasn't Scott who they'd picked up. Stephen Wayne Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce were apprehended on January 2nd, at 1406 Tenaya Drive in Modesto, after police received a tip from an informant named Mark. Mark said that some of the items stolen from the residence of Rodolfo and Susan Medina were in Todd's possession. After officers recovered some of the stolen jewelry and a large safe from Todd's address, they arrested him and promptly learned about his accomplice, Donald Pierce. During his interview with Officer Michael Hicks, Todd initially denied any involvement with the burglary. But when confronted with the obvious evidence, he admitted to the crime, claiming it occurred on December 27th. He later changed his story, saying he and Pierce committed the burglary on the 26th, between 3 and 7 a.m. However, the media and police presence in the neighborhood was intense after Laci went missing, and local reporter Ted Rowlands recalls being in front of the house before dawn on the 26th. He said his head was on a swivel that day, and he would have interviewed the burglars about Laci if they'd been across the street that morning. And then there was the witness to the crime. Diane Jackson reported seeing 3 men with a van and a safe in front of the Medina's house at 11:40 a.m. on December 24th, but Modesto police arranged for her to be hypnotized by an unqualified hypnotist, and her testimony wasn't heard by the jury. However, some of the information she provided was presented when Detective Craig Grogan took the stand, and we'll go over what the jury did hear about the burglary during the trial portion of the series. Not long after Todd and Pierce were arrested, Sergeant Ron Cloward made a public request for the items stolen from the Medina's home to be turned into the police department. Subsequently, a woman ran into the lobby at the station, threw a bag of the Medina's jewelry on the counter, and ran away. The incident wasn't recorded on the security camera, and the woman wasn't pursued. Todd received a sentence of 8 years and 8 months for the burglary, though it should have been far more as a repeat offender in California, and Donald Pierce received 180 days in county jail. There are several other details surrounding the burglary that we'll get into in a later episode, including a disturbing tip from a guard at the Stanislaus County Jail, links to a freaky family that hung out by a nearby reservoir, the destruction of the safe found in Stephen Todd's possession, the gold Croton watch pawned by Deanna Renfro, and her possible connection to the Medina burglars, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell, so you don't miss it. While Sharon was relieved to hear it wasn't Scott who'd been arrested, she was also disappointed to see the only solid lead pointing away from him turn out to be a dead end. And although it wouldn't be long before she began to feel very differently about him being incarcerated, she was glad to have Grogan and the rest of the detectives available to answer her questions. They told her from the beginning she could call any one of them at any hour, day or night, and Sharon called them often, though they weren't always able to give her the answers she was looking for. Just as she'd called to ask about the Medina burglary, she'd also asked about the bloodhound tracking Laci sent away from the park. She read in the Modesto Bee that morning that the dog handler thought the scent came from a car leading away from the house, and she wanted to know if the trail brought them any closer to finding her daughter. Though similar to the Medina burglary, police weren't willing to discuss anything that wasn't already printed in the newspaper, and gave her no new information. But Sharon also began calling them with leads as well. Her own phone hadn't stopped ringing since Laci disappeared. Many of the people who called offered their support and encouragement or wanted to contribute resources to the search, but others called her at home to report sightings and suspicious activity they thought might be important to the case. While it was encouraging for Sharon to learn there were hundreds of leads coming into the tip line, it's fortunate she didn't hear most of them. They would have terrified her even more. One man saw a woman with short dark hair being forced into a van by 2 men not far from their neighborhood, and a woman heard screaming near the restrooms in the park on the morning of the 24th. Another woman said she saw Laci and Mackenzie in the park being closely followed and cursed at by 2 men heading west along Dry Creek, while another witness said she may have seen a possible abduction near the entrance to the park that morning. But some of the calls were even more frightening. Modesto PD officers Locke and Biffa investigated a terrifying tip that came in on the 10th of January about Tracy, a rural community 40 minutes west of Modesto. The following are the operator's notes on the Tracy tip that were read to the jury during the trial. Eastbound 205 at Tracy, take the first exit at the first bridge, which is a county area, and turn right. Caller says this is not a populated area of town, but rather a county area. Does not know the name of the road. Go down 4 to 5 miles, you'll see 2 white houses on the left side of the road. In front of the second house is an old abandoned white pickup. Behind the house is a van, where you can store feed for horses. They have a pregnant woman there. He states he recognized her to be Laci. The caller's home is actually 2 to 3 hours away from there and he wants to remain completely anonymous. He doesn't want the reward money, just wants her to be found. Claims they are abusing and hurting her. He saw Laci's picture on the missing persons poster, and just wanted to save her. We'll go over the investigation into this chilling lead later in the series, but in early January there were dozens of tips coming in describing scenarios just as disturbing, and they were the last thing Sharon needed to hear at the time, so thankfully the bulk of the calls were to the tip line. But as her phone at home also began to ring off the hook, and her attempts to screen the calls occasionally failed, she wasn't sheltered from some of the unsettling information coming in. After returning home from her last private moment with Scott at the Red Lion on the 28th, Sharon was exhausted. Their conversation had been emotional and taxing, and she may not have bothered to answer the phone at all, tired as she was, but she did. When she picked up the receiver, she could hear a woman whispering. Sharon listened carefully. The woman was saying she had some information about Scott. She tiredly told the whispering woman to call the tip line to report what she knew, but the lady wouldn't hang up. Still whispering, she insisted to Sharon that what she had to say was important, but that she had to stay quiet. Her husband was in the next room, and she didn't want him to hear her. He told her not to call. The woman began giving dates and details, saying she had first-hand knowledge of an affair. She also gave the alleged mistress's name. By the time they hung up, Sharon was very upset. She was angry at the thought of Scott cheating, but she wasn't ready to believe it. She'd never viewed him that way, but she'd also never heard anyone accuse him of such a thing, and her daughter had certainly never gone missing before. Now that Laci was in danger, she was trying to work things from all angles, but turning her eye to Scott as a cheater was still very difficult for her. Perhaps because when she considered it for too long, her anger turned to fear, and she'd go right back to examining Scott's behavior. Coupled with the change she'd seen in him since her daughter disappeared, and the questions she already had about his involvement, it was overwhelming for her to think about what an affair might mean for Laci. She called Kim Peterson for advice about the call. Kim told her she should report the details to detectives and let them investigate, but Sharon was fearful of what they might find. Connecting her pregnant missing daughter to Scott's bizarre secretive behavior was difficult enough for her. In her mind, evidence of an affair would all but seal Laci's fate, but she had to know if it was true. After hanging up with Kim, she called Rocha to ask him to find the woman. Even though it was late on a Saturday night, she only hesitated a moment before dialing the detective's cell phone. Sharon told him all about the call from the whispering lady and the name she was given, but Rocha said he was already aware of it. It turns out the whispering woman had called the tip line days before, and detectives looked into it right away. They quickly determined her story about the affair and the mistress to be false, but just as Sharon let out a small sigh of relief, he presented her with an interesting question. Rocha asked her, "Would it surprise you to learn Scott was unfaithful?" Sharon told him yes. Yes, it certainly would surprise her very much. Rocha apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, I just wanted to know your opinion." The fact that he asked her this question on the 28th of December makes it slightly more intriguing. Less than 12 hours later, Amber Frey would also call the tip line with some information about Scott, although it would be another 2 weeks before Sharon learned what she'd had to say. The first week of January was a busy one for detectives, and for Harvey Kemple as well. Scott began to make a more concerted effort to dodge the media, and though he said later it wasn't his intention, he was ultimately evading the police at the same time. He'd been trailed constantly by both over the past week, and he started finding ways to prevent being shadowed. Police had a GPS tracker put on Laci's Land Rover by the time they returned it to him on the 3rd, but they often physically followed him in unmarked vehicles too. And once detectives discovered how difficult it was to keep surveillance on the house without Scott seeing them parked out front, they came up with a less conspicuous way to keep an eye on him. They installed a camera on a utility pole out front, left it trained on the driveway, and watched the stream from a van parked not far away. The van was manned 24/7 so detectives would know when Scott was coming and going from the house, and they were able to record if anything eventful took place. This camera was still on the pole through the fall of 2003, when preliminary hearings began in Scott's trial, and it will come back up in the craziest way later in the series, but for now, Scott started putting time and effort into renting and borrowing cars to stay under the radar, whether it be from the media or law enforcement. It was obvious he wasn't interested in being watched and trailed anymore. But his bizarre outings that began the first day he got Laci's truck back, and his ramped-up motivation to prevent being followed, did nothing but make detectives more suspicious, if that was even possible. By now they were far from alone in making their dark assumptions about Scott, and they would have a little help keeping tabs on him from Harvey. Harvey Kemple suspected something was very off about Scott's story, after hearing 2 different alibis from him the night Laci disappeared. Scott told Harvey he'd gone golfing that day, but he became immediately alarmed when he heard otherwise from his wife. Harvey is married to Sharon's cousin Gwen, who was also at the house the night of the 24th, and when she told him Scott was fishing at Berkeley, Harvey'd been suspicious of him since. By early January, he'd become distrustful enough to start following him as well. His first inclination to trail Scott from the volunteer center came after watching him turn away from Paradise Road where he said he was going to hang flyers. When Harvey saw him turn right instead of left, he fell into traffic a few cars behind, to see where he was really headed. Scott wasn't driving his truck that day. Harvey said he assumed it was his father's or his brother's, but he kept his eyes on it, taking care not to be seen as Scott drove to the mall and parked. The mall was closed, and the lot was empty, so Harvey stayed fairly far away while he watched him sit there for around 45 minutes. Initially he thought Scott might be waiting to meet other people to do flyers with, as he had frequently done before, but when no one ever came, that was obviously not the case. Harvey stayed until Scott finally pulled out of the parking lot, but didn't follow, and when asked later if he saw Scott get out of the truck while parked at the mall, Harvey said he was so far away, he wouldn't have been able to tell. The second time he followed Scott was to the country club, and though Harvey didn't stop this time, he thought the visit was highly inappropriate under the circumstances. Harvey has another story to tell about Scott's inappropriate behavior that he didn't mention to law enforcement until 6 months later, after Detective Bueller began hearing his tale from other witnesses, but we'll get into that a little later. As for Bueller, the 3rd of January was another busy day working Laci's case. He'd contacted Scott's neighbor Karen Service a few days prior, asking her to solidify the exact time she put Mackenzie back into the yard on the 24th. Karen's information would help prosecutors try to sew up Scott's timeline by matching it with cell tower pings later, but early on, they needed to know if the timing and witnesses connected the Medina burglary to Laci's disappearance. Essentially, what detectives were hearing was that Mackenzie was found wandering and put back in the yard by Karen Service, over an hour before Diane Jackson reported seeing the van at the Medinas at 11:40. Meaning, Laci was already gone on her walk and let loose of the dog, long before Jackson saw people across the street that morning, if indeed she'd gone for a walk that day in the first place. This helped police to close the door on the burglary connection, but let's hear some details about Karen's timeline for the 24th. She initially told Scott and Detective Brocchini that she found Mackenzie in the street around 10:30, but it was only based upon her best guess those first few days, and it wasn't until she found a receipt in her laundry around the 1st of January that she was able to narrow things down. Karen was going out to run errands on the morning of the 24th, one of them being a stop at Austin's Christmas store to shop for ornaments. She backed her car out of her driveway, but before she took it out of reverse, she looked over to see Mackenzie looking back at her. He was standing in the street next to her driver's side window. Karen knew Scott and Laci fairly well. She and her 9-year-old son were invited to their house to swim often, they attended barbecues and had dinners together, so she was also very familiar with Mackenzie. When she saw him in the street with his leash on, she parked her car along the curb, got out, and checked his tags, making certain it was him. She noticed several things as she returned him to the yard, the first being that Mackenzie's leash was wet, with grass clippings and bits of leaves stuck to it. Her description of the leash was very similar to Scott's, though he said it had some mud on it as well. As a side note, the debris and mud they described isn't very visible in the photos taken of it later. Another thing Karen noticed was an older white balding man walking from the direction of the park, but she didn't see anyone else, specifically confirming there was no one outside of either the Krigbaum house or the Medina house. But she did hear something. As Karen walked Mackenzie up to the front gate, she could hear someone raking leaves. Seeing Laci's car in the driveway, she assumed she would find her out back, doing yard work. But when she tried to open the gate, it was locked. Karen got a little panicked when she couldn't open it, not so much about Laci at this point, but more so about what she would do with Mackenzie if she couldn't put him away in the yard. She made her way across the lawn, toward the other gate near the driveway, and recalled that the grass was wet. Karen said it hadn't rained in Modesto for a couple of days, but the sky was overcast, with no sun to burn off the morning dew. When she got around the other end of the house, she was relieved to see the side gate ajar. She led Mackenzie out back, but there was no Laci doing yard work as she suspected. She walked along the length of the pool and peeked around the corner into the side lawn. Still no Laci, but she could now hear that the raking sound was coming from one of the houses behind theirs. Karen went back along the path she'd taken into the yard, told Mackenzie goodbye and to stay, and went out the side gate, closing it behind her. She set about running her errands, but when she looked at her hands on the way back to the car, they were so dirty from the leash she stopped herself from brushing them off on her jeans, and quickly went back inside to clean up. Initially, her guess was that she'd seen Mackenzie in the street around 10:30, but when she found the receipt from Austin's Christmas store in her laundry days later, she knew that couldn't be accurate. The receipt said she'd checked out at 10:34, telling her it must have been much earlier than 10:30 when she got the dog. So, she got in the car and took another trip to Austin's, using the receipt to get a closer estimation of the time she'd left home. She'd pulled off at the bank before heading to the store, but after driving through the parking lot, unable to find a space, she decided to do her ornament shopping at Austin's first. She was in the store for just 5 minutes before checking out, and based on her backtracking, Karen changed the time she'd found Mackenzie, from 10:30 to 10:18. She sent a note with her explanation for the change, along with the receipt from Austin's, to Detective Bueller on the 3rd. As the sun went down that evening, the family gathered at the home of a woman named Joan. Joan invited them over for dinner, but when Sharon got there, Scott hadn't arrived yet. Joan told her he'd offered to bring the wine that night, and thought maybe he was running late having to pick it up. He showed up soon after with several bottles in his arms, but as they talked later, he explained that it wasn't the extra stop for the wine that had made him late. Scott walked to the police department to pick up Laci's car that afternoon, after dropping off his rented car a few blocks away, but when he got there, detectives wanted him to stay and have a quick chat. They asked him about the anchor in the boat, which he said he made himself to save money because Bruce Peterson, the man who'd sold him the boat, didn't include his anchor in the sale. Detective Bueller said he'd never seen an anchor like that, but Scott explained he'd gotten the idea from a boat rental place in San Diego years before. At that point, they had him stripped down to his underwear so they could take pictures. They photographed him front and back, noting no visible injuries, and then they took him to the hospital to draw blood samples. Over dinner with Sharon that night, he explained that they'd fingerprinted him as well, telling her they asked about the bruising on his hands right afterwards. Scott looked exasperated and said it wasn't bruising, it was the ink from the prints they just took. Sharon was trying to get a better look at his hands from across the table without being too obvious when she heard him say, "Yeah, it's all part of the investigation." But she stopped cold when he said, "They even showed me pictures from the internet that are supposed to be me and some girl." Eyebrows went up around the entire table at that last bit, and he began to nod his head, casually continuing as they stared at him wide-eyed, while he said, "Yeah, you know, I have to say they did a really good job, because the guy actually looked a lot like me." On January 4th, Scott drove Laci's car out to the highway where the trailing dogs were working during our last episode. But while Officer Applegate dealt with Scott at the roadblock, Sharon was back in Modesto picking up Laci's wedding ring. We'll recall that in November, Laci taken some pieces of jewelry from her inheritance to Edwards to have them appraised. As a way to memorialize her grandma, she had plans to incorporate a stone from one of her rings into her wedding band. She wore a gorgeous sapphire ring in its place while hers was in the shop, but she was a touch indecisive, and hadn't settled on a design for the new setting yet. The jeweler had possession of Laci's wedding set, until police called about it a few days after she'd vanished. They wanted to take the rings into evidence on the 27th, but the shop owner wouldn't allow it. He knew Laci, and he knew her grandparents Bob and Helen, and wasn't willing to release her property without permission from Sharon. She'd called Edwards on the afternoon of the 4th and gave her consent for investigators to take possession of the rings, but figured she'd better go look at the jewelry, to see exactly what she was releasing. When she and her girlfriend Sandy got to Edwards, she was happy to learn that investigators settled for photographs to submit as evidence, and Sharon was glad to take them with her that day, rather than handing them over to police. Meanwhile, Scott began making a series of bizarre trips out to the bay, pushing the limits to escape police surveillance, and causing detectives to take an even harder look at both his movements and his behavior. On the 5th of January, he borrowed a silver Subaru from his friend Aaron Fritz. Aaron met Scott after moving to San Diego from Indiana, enrolling as a freshman in the same high school. A sophomore at the time, Scott saw Aaron struggling to fit in, and began to include him in his own circle of friends. The two stayed in touch through their college years, though they attended separate schools. Aaron came to Modesto to support his friend after hearing his wife disappeared, and when Scott asked to borrow his car on the 5th of January, Aaron didn't hesitate. Scott drove his silver Subaru to the parking lot at the marina, got out, and looked out at the water for about 5 minutes. He then got back in the car and drove back to Modesto. The drive to Berkeley from Modesto is 83 miles, one way, and as detectives considered that he'd spent 4 hours getting there and back, just to look at the water for a few minutes, they saw it as a huge red flag. But when he made the exact same trip the following day in a rented car and spent even less time looking at the water, they were convinced he was likely revisiting the scene of the crime. Scott later said he was there checking on the progress of the search, but he was there for such a short amount of time, not asking questions or speaking to any of the search teams or the harbor master. Detectives had a hard time believing his explanation. They'd followed him to Berkeley from the moment he swapped Laci's Land Rover for the rental car that morning, and by the time Scott pulled out of the small circle drive near the boat launch on the 6th, police were trailing him closely, and he knew it. Though at the time, he said he thought it was the media and drove like a maniac to get them off his tail. He made sudden stops and U-turns on the freeway and pulled into parking lots for a moment, just to speed away in the opposite direction to shake them off, and it worked. They lost him along the way back to Modesto, until the little red Honda he rented pulled up outside of the volunteer center. He went inside for a short while, before returning to Enterprise to pick up Laci's truck, but it wouldn't be his last trip to the marina, nor the last time he tried to throw the police off his trail, though he's always maintained that he believed it was the press he was escaping, rather than law enforcement. On the evening of the 7th, Joan made plans for the family and some others to meet out for dinner at a local restaurant, but Sharon canceled, not wanting much to do with socializing. When Scott heard she wasn't going, he canceled as well, and he called Sharon to see if they could have a smaller private dinner together at her place instead. Scott's parents came with him, and his father was immediately comforted being at Sharon's house, saying how nice it was to be in a real home environment. He and Jackie been living out of a Red Lion hotel room for the past 2 weeks, and it seems Lee was beginning to feel ways about that, and Jackie spoke up about it over dinner. She told Sharon they'd been in the hotel since police conducted their search warrant on the 26th, and that Scott hadn't invited them back to stay at the house since. Police were done with their work by the 27th, but Scott told his parents he preferred they stay at the Red Lion. At this point, Jackie mockingly said it was because Scott needed his privacy, putting a major emphasis on the word privacy and sounding annoyed. Sharon could tell the comment irritated him, but he only grinned at Jackie in response. She thought Scott was ready to say something to his mother, but instead he kept his eyes on his plate, put a smirk on his face and stayed silent. As Sharon watched him, she was perplexed at his ability to compose himself. It made her wonder if his capability to push that down might help to explain his lack of emotion surrounding Laci's disappearance as well. Scott had always been quiet and reserved. He was never one to show big emotions around anything, and perhaps Laci's disappearance had caused him to temper himself even more. In that moment, she may have flashed back briefly to a comment she'd made in an interview that morning, but hadn't meant to. In an attempt to defend him from yet another round of questions about his involvement, Sharon responded by saying, "The Scott we know would never harm Laci." The words had come out without thinking, and she hadn't realized she'd said it until later, but as time went on, it would become a recurring question for her. She would ask herself what the hell it meant to know him at all. She began to feel that she knew him less and less every day, and she wondered if it was conceivable that the Scott she didn't know could be a murderer. More and more, Sharon began to detach her son-in-law, whom she loved, trusted, and welcomed into her family, from the man she interacted with after the 24th of December, and she would eventually define them as different people entirely. Years later, Sharon was asked if she had anything to say to Scott, or if there was anything she'd like him to say to her. She said no, because that wasn't Scott, and that man was a stranger to her. The Scott she knew vanished along with her daughter on Christmas Eve, in 2002. This unintentional slip on the 7th of January was the first outward sign of Sharon's separation of the man from the monster, in order to comprehend what may have happened to her daughter. Several people described Scott as being in a state of shock in the days just after his wife vanished, but what she saw that night, with Jackie over dinner, was a more deliberate burial of his feelings. Sharon was able to clearly see he wasn't happy with Jackie's mocking dig about his privacy, and she was amazed to see him not only hold his tongue, but plaster a grin on his face in response. Maybe he was just shoving everything down deep, including the anguish, fear, and panic over Laci. But her opinion about his state of mind changed a little while later, when Scott flipped out while they watched Hannity and Combs on TV after dinner. Sharon said it was surreal to watch the news as Laci began to dominate the airwaves, and it's hard to imagine how that would feel, knowing the program about to come on would be centered on your family, but for Sharon, every broadcast kept Laci alive. She would turn on her television, see her daughter's smiling face, and be comforted thinking, there she is, there's Laci, she's still here with me. The media provided a distraction for her, and Sharon found solace in coverage at times. But the constant reporting was far less soothing for Scott. By now he'd taken center stage in the press, despite his efforts to stay on the sidelines, and as Hannity's guest told the audience he thought Scott Peterson very likely murdered his wife, he went off. He leapt up and began pacing the floor, calling the expert an idiot. He began ranting and yelling about getting the phone number so he could give them a piece of his mind, until Jackie told him to calm himself. Sharon said as far as she knew, he never tried to get the number and never called the show to complain, adding that his bark was worse than his bite. But she also said that this was about the only significant show of emotion she'd seen from him since Laci disappeared, and to her, that wasn't a great sign. He stalked around the room a bit more, but then took his mother's advice and sat down, muttering to himself as he refilled his wine. A short while later, Sharon told Scott and his parents about her visit to the jeweler's a few days before. She let him know Laci's wedding set was in her safe deposit box at the bank, and if he wanted it, all he had to do was ask, but Scott didn't respond. She realized it might not be at the top of his mind at the moment, but, assuming eventually he would want it for sentimental reasons, she expected it to come up later. Sharon's last moment alone with Scott may have been at the Red Lion Hotel the week before, but they'd had a handful of dinners like this one and spoken on the phone many times up until his arrest in April. During all of those encounters and conversations, he didn't mention Laci's wedding ring even once. At 7 o'clock on the morning of the 9th, the surveillance team watched Scott put 2 suitcases into a Sonoma S10 truck he'd rented the day before. He left town around 10:30 to make another trip to the marina. He drove around the parking lot a bit, and parked for a few minutes looking out at the water before pulling away. He drove from there to the San Luis Reservoir, which had been listed as a second search location in the Modesto Bay that morning, and our next episode will pick up with Scott heading out of town with his suitcases. Unaware he was leaving town, Sharon also read an article in the Modesto Bay the morning of the 9th, not about the reservoir search, but about other missing persons cases in the area. She learned that of the 1,400 people reported missing to the Modesto Police Department in 2002, all but 2 had been found. One of them was Laci. Police made an announcement later that afternoon, informing the press and the public that they discovered an object on the seafloor. They said the object was large, and though poor weather conditions and diver fatigue prevented them from investigating further, they were somewhat confident that they'd found a body in the bay. Thanks so much for watching. Join us next time to learn what divers recovered from the cold, dark water and how Sharon struggled as the date for Laci's baby shower for little Connor came and went. We'll also discover where Scott was headed after packing his bags the morning of the 9th, and what spurred police to administer a polygraph test on Laci's brother, Brent. And just when we thought we knew all there was to know about Scott, we'll discover the secret he'd worked so hard to bury after Laci vanished, and the explosive impact the truth had on the families, law enforcement, and the world, as the media helped the public become fixated on the scandal. If you enjoy the content and want to hear more stories like this one, please consider supporting the channel with the super thanks button below, or visiting our Patreon page linked in the description, and of course, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for your support. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.